NATO has already confirmed Jens Stoltenberg is staying on as Secretary General for another year. That's solved the initial issue of succession, for now at least. But as the alliance meets for its 2023 summit, what other challenges does it face? And more specifically, what can be done about Ukraine? Welcome to Roundtable. I'm Philip Hampshire. Ukraine casts a long shadow over the 2023 NATO summit being held in Vilnius this week. Not only is there the issue of how to help Kyiv stay in the fight against Moscow, there's also pressure on NATO from President Zelensky to offer Ukraine a route to membership. That's a tough ask during Europe's biggest conflict since World War II, and it also seems unlikely to happen. And then there's a feeling that persuading Jens Stoltenberg to stay on as Secretary General for another year is just kicking the can down the road, while an acceptable candidate is found amid rumours that there is behind-the-scenes manoeuvring. So let's discuss this complex NATO summit further. I'm joined in the studio by Shea, a former Deputy Assistant Secretary General of NATO. Meanwhile, in Camberley in the UK, Martin Smith, a Senior Lecturer in Defence and International Affairs at the Royal Military Academy, Sandhurst. And in Washington, D.C., we have Elisabeth Braw, who's a Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where she focuses on defence against emerging national security challenges. So, Jamie, I'm going to start with you because you're here in the studio with me. I have a quote here from President Zelensky in Ukraine, and he has this to say about the current upcoming summit. If we are not given a signal in Vilnius, I believe there is no point for Ukraine to be at this summit. Now, those seem like very, very strong words for him to say. And if he didn't go, wouldn't that upset all the other NATO members?
I think it would upset all of the NATO members, but I also think it would be a diplomatic own goal for Ukraine. And I don't believe for 1 minute that Zelensky will not show up. The summit was organised in Vilnius a year ago precisely to be near Ukraine and make it easy for him to participate. And I think that even if Zelensky won't get what he wants the most, which is immediate NATO membership, what NATO has put together is a pretty comprehensive package of things for Ukraine: military support, upgrading of the NATO-Ukraine Council, a fast-track approach to membership when the allies are ready to move ahead after the war. There's enough there for him to be able to turn up and claim victory. I think this is all posturing, try to up the ante at the last minute, part of the usual diplomatic game. But will he be in Vilnius next week? Absolutely.
Let me bring this across to you, Martin. I'm assuming you believe that President Zelensky will absolutely be in Vilnius and there talking to everyone else.
Absolutely. My take on what he was saying is that he wouldn't actually have come out with something like that if he wasn't confident up front that, of course, there was going to be, as he puts it, a signal that Ukraine is. Everybody knows Ukraine is not going to be given a date for joining Vilnius. That has been flagged up and made very, very clear. And the Ukrainian government has publicly accepted that, and the reasons why that can't be for a country in the middle of a war with nearly 20% of its territory under hostile occupation. But as Jamie's just outlined, NATO members are in the process of finalising a significant program of military and political and diplomatic support, which puts Ukraine, in my view, very clearly on the path to membership at some point. So I would say that Ukrainian membership of NATO, we don't know when it's going to come, we don't know precisely how it's going to come, but it is now, I would suggest, inevitable that it will happen at some point in the not too distant future.
Do you think anyone in NATO is going to dare to outline some of those unknowns, or are they going to want to keep them unknown for now simply because it's too thorny an issue?
I think they will want to keep them unknown for two reasons. First of all, the one that you suggested, it's a thorny issue. If anybody sought to outline and sought to initiate discussion on those sorts of issues, there's the potential for differences of opinion amongst the NATO members and for differences and divergences to emerge, which is the last thing that any NATO member state wants at a very high-profile summit. And also, I think the other side of the coin is at the moment that they're not sure. They haven't reached agreement on the precise modalities. I suspect, Jamie will probably have a better track on this than I do, that they haven't reached agreement even on when Ukraine will be formally invited to join. So these are issues that it's actually, for a country in the middle of a war, it's probably not possible to go hard and fast anyway. And by putting those issues, seeking to put those issues on the agenda, the risk is that all you do is have an inconclusive discussion, but at the same time, a divisive and potentially damaging discussion that reveals cracks and divisions amongst NATO members.
Elisabeth, let me bring this across to you. If we're looking at this situation where Zelensky said, I need a signal from NATO that something is coming, is he going to get a signal flare? Is he going to get a bonfire? Is he just going to get a quiet secret handshake and a whisper in his ear so that it's not made too explicit exactly what deals are being done with Ukraine right now? What do you think, Elisabeth?
The US government and US Congress are used to proposing American candidates for various multilateral organizations. So there's no surprise that other countries would try to do the same thing for senior politicians in their countries. And we should remember that, and this is well known in Washington as well, we should remember that the countries that have joined NATO since the end of the Cold War, that used to be on the other side of the Iron Curtain, they don't really have anybody in a position of senior leadership in any multilateral organization at the moment. And so they feel it's their turn, and there is sympathy in Washington for that. There's just no consensus about who that person should be. And I think that is the difficult part. There is a lot of sympathy, a lot of understanding, but no strong candidate from either a former Warsaw Pact country or indeed from a Western European country. So I don't think there's irritation in Washington that countries are putting their candidates forward. There's just perhaps irritation that they haven't been able to agree on one candidate, maybe from the former Warsaw Pact and one from perhaps the original NATO member states.
Jamie, let me bring this over to you. We've had some comments from Stoltenberg as well come out. He actually put out a tweet ahead of the summit in which he said, and I quote, "A very good conversation with President Zelensky on the latest developments in Ukraine and our preparations for the NATO summit. In Vilnius, allies will take decisions to step up support for the long haul, upgrade our political ties, and bring Ukraine closer to NATO." Is that all that Vilnius is going to be about, do you think? Is it all going to be about Ukraine?
Well, the key thing, I think, for the media, given the war in Ukraine at the moment, is obviously what NATO has to say about Ukraine. My own view is that the key thing is to keep the weapons supplies running now, because it's quite obvious that if this offensive is successful, if the Ukrainians are able to push the Russians back and liberate their territory, they're going to be a much more attractive candidate for NATO than a country which is permanently in some kind of low-intensity conflict with Russia, which is divided, which has a ruined economy, and so on. So I think that if you get the short-term right, the solution to these long-term issues of Ukraine's integration become easier. The second thing, Philip, which I think you have to bear in mind, that if NATO says to Ukraine, OK, the day after the conflict ends, you're going to join, that's sending a message to President Putin, Vladimir, keep the conflict going, precisely to avoid Ukraine joining NATO, which would put the decision really on NATO's or Ukraine's membership of NATO, not in the hands of NATO, but in the hands of Russia, which would be an absurdity. So my sense is that clearly...
There's a certain level of strategic ambiguity, is what you're saying.
Yes.
It's almost necessary here.
I think it's important to send a signal that the whole thing is moving forward and there's only one end station, which is that Ukraine will join NATO. But I think that that, first of all, the timing has to remain in NATO's hands. You also have to remember, Philip, that before the conflict broke out, Ukraine did have some domestic issues with corruption, for example, with rule of law. And NATO membership is about well-functioning democratic institutions and not just about good interoperable armies, particularly at a time when the West is gearing up to spend potentially billions upon billions of dollars for Ukraine's reconstruction as well. And I think the next thing, which is going to be important in Vilnius, is that if Ukraine knows that it cannot join NATO immediately, will the United States, the UK, France, Germany be prepared to come forward with what people are calling security guarantees or security assurances? Some kind of, we've got your back, Ukraine, in this sort of intermediate period, which will satisfy Zelensky that the whole thing is moving forward and NATO is not stalling.
Martin, I'm assuming you agree with all of that.
Absolutely. And the only point I'd add to what Jamie said is that Ukraine, in terms of the security guarantees that everybody's talking about, Ukraine has never had those. And I think there's an important distinction to be drawn. Sometimes the phrase is used a little bit loosely and generally between security guarantees, which is ultimately what NATO membership offers, which is a legal treaty-based commitment that an attack on any one member state shall be considered by all the members as an attack on all. So the principle of collective defense. What Ukraine has previously had are basically paper declarations saying we're interested in your security, we're concerned about it, we're aware of the fact that under international law it is illegal for one state to attack and try to coercively take territory from another state. But these previous agreements, the Budapest Memorandum that Jamie referred to, and the 2008 NATO Bucharest Summit declaration that one day, at some point, Ukraine would become a NATO member, but there was nothing put in place by way of a process to actually begin to prepare and facilitate that. They are essentially empty declarations, whereas what we've got now is, as we all know, significant and ongoing, and I would suggest really durable programs of military aid and assistance, training of Ukrainian forces, and they are open-ended. It's been made very clear constantly. Mr. Stoltenberg and other NATO leaders have said we are in this for as long as it takes. And that's not just talk, because now Ukraine has got the actual assistance programs going forward to actually back that up. So that is the big difference, it seems to me, between what Ukraine has now and what it had previously with the paper declarations that weren't, in any real sense, security guarantees at all.
Elisabeth, going into this conference, we were expecting some kind of announcement about who was going to be in charge of NATO. Now, it's not being discussed at the conference now because NATO have rushed out the week before the conference came out that Jens Stoltenberg is going to have his tenure up at the top of the organisation extended by yet another year, the second time it's been extended now, I believe. Now, as that goes through, is the reason that they've got this out of the way simply because they don't want to talk about it at NATO, or did they have some other reason to get this done now? They didn't want a row over who's going to be the next boss.
Zelensky won't get a bonfire for sure. He won't get a massive announcement. And that's that was always unlikely anyway, because what Ukraine wants is full membership or a path to full membership in the near future. And that is simply not possible for a country that's in the middle of a war, albeit a war not caused by that country itself. And what NATO will instead offer Ukraine is what one might call a piece of red meat, generous support, generous assistance. But we should also remember that this is an issue that NATO's member states have been debating, discussing, negotiating about for over many months now. Some felt very strongly that Ukraine should get a tangible path towards membership in the near future. And those countries were primarily the Baltic states and Poland, a few other countries like that. Others felt very strongly that that would be irresponsible to offer at this point. So what we'll get is a painstakingly negotiated package that says nice things about Ukraine, offers strong support to Ukraine, doesn't commit to a time frame in terms of NATO membership for Ukraine.
Jamie, we'll talk about who some of the potential new names are for the top of NATO, but if we look at Jens Stoltenberg himself, does it make a difference that he's staying in for a year versus if it had been one of the other names on the list? For instance, Ursula von der Leyen was one of the names that was bandied about. Does the personality at the top of NATO make a difference on what happens to Ukraine?
Well, I think, yes, at the moment. I mean, obviously, NATO can't keep Jens there forever, and any good organisation worth its salt has to be able to do succession planning in an orderly way, obviously. But I think there were three sort of reasons. Number one is Jens is a good cheerleader, if I can use that phrase. He's a good advocate on Ukraine for making the case for why we should stay the course, weapons should be transferred and so on. And it's difficult to find somebody who's going to be as effective as that. Number two, I think looking at the United States and the presidential election next year, particularly with Mr. Trump leading the Republican opinion polls at the moment, you want somebody who can really get into the US and make the case that Europeans are spending the money, burden sharing, the 2% of GDP on defence and that sort of thing, which Jens did very well with Trump when he was president. And I think the third thing is Sweden is still not a member of NATO. The Turkish parliament, Turkish government have not moved ahead on that yet, neither has Hungary. It's a delicate issue, and Stoltenberg is the one who at NATO, today in fact there's a meeting at NATO, who has been bringing Sweden and NATO and Turkey together to try to find out what the basis of an agreement could be. He's one of the few Western leaders who is liked by President Erdogan of Turkey, who has his ear. And so I think for those three reasons, changing the captain on the deck in a storm wasn't really the best thing to do.
They were lucky he could stay on, I suppose.
Well, he didn't want to initially because, in fact, he's been extended 3 times. He's almost going to be the record holder for a NATO Secretary General. And early on, there was a sense, let's ask Jens to stay for another year. And it was Stoltenberg who was saying, no, thanks. I've stood down. I don't need to stay longer to prove that I've been a good Secretary General. But as Elisabeth rightly pointed out, once it became clear that there were a variety of candidates, and it wasn't going to be possible in a short time frame to get a consensus, NATO needed more time, then I think Jens fell on his patriotic sword, as it were, and agreed to stay on. But that doesn't absolve NATO of the responsibility in the year that does lie ahead, this time round, to be able to come to consensus on an orderly and timely successor.
Martin, let me pass the hot potato across to you and give you the list of potential successors that were doing the rounds in the various newspapers across Europe. We don't have time for all 150-odd names that were being bandied about, but the top ones appear to have been the Danish Prime Minister, Mette Frederiksen, Ben Wallace, the British Defence Secretary, Kaja Kallas, Estonian Prime Minister. A lot of people in favour of Kaja Kallas because they were looking for a female head of NATO. And, of course, that also cropped up with the name then of Ursula von der Leyen, the European Commission President. Were you surprised that none of those were picked? Would you have thought one of these is head and shoulders above the others or not? And would it make a difference for NATO if one of them, a difference for Ukraine if one of them had been picked as head of NATO?
No, I agree with Jamie. I think Ukraine's interest is best served by having the current incumbent, Mr. Stoltenberg, stay in post. And I think, would it have been better in the here and now? Probably not, because they're all distinguished names. They're all very experienced people, but none of them are experienced within the NATO context. And with the best will in the world, anybody coming into NATO, given that coming to the position of NATO Secretary General, given that NATO has all these major issues on its agenda, given that we're in the middle of the most significant conflict in Europe since World War II, would have had to have spent some time getting up to speed and learning on the job. And this is probably the worst possible backdrop to expect anybody, however eminent, to do that. So I agree with Jamie. I think Mr. Stoltenberg has committed to another year. I suspect many of the names that have been discussed this time, not all, but many of them will still be in the frame when the time comes to reopen the discussion over the course of 2024. It's not clear, and again, I agree with Jamie, finally, if there'd been an outstanding candidate this time who was clearly head and shoulders above everybody else in terms of relevant experience, and it was clear that member states could have coalesced without too many problems behind them, then we may nevertheless have seen that there was a move to actually appoint a new Secretary General, notwithstanding what I said earlier. But I think the discussion and the debate is still to be had and will be had again in a year or so's time. And it's not clear from the list of individuals, even if they're all in their names are all in the frame next time, precisely because it's such a strong field. It's not clear that there is a single outstanding candidate who is more likely to get the nod than anybody else.
Well, let me bring Elisabeth in. Elisabeth, from the other side of the Atlantic, looking at this from Washington, D.C., is it somewhat tiresome, the amount of bickering between various smaller European nations over, oh, no, it should be someone from a European Union nation this time. Oh, no, it should be someone from Southern Europe because they haven't had it for a couple of decades. Oh, no, it has to be someone from the United Kingdom. How is this bickering viewed over in Washington?
NATO is an incredibly important juncture. We should remember that for almost 20 years, more than 20 years after the end of the Cold War, it wasn't really sure what NATO should be about. It is an alliance founded to defend its members' territory against Warsaw Pact aggression. And for many years, there was just no aggression on the horizon in Europe. And as a result, it didn't really matter all that much who was the Secretary General, because NATO was nice to have, but not all that decisive to countries, its member states' fortune. Now we are in a completely different position where NATO is again absolutely vital to the continued prosperity and well-being of its member states. So it does matter a great deal who's in charge. And Jens Stoltenberg, who has received a one-year extension, or rather he has accepted a one-year extension. He wanted to step down, but in the end, the NATO member states convinced him to stay simply because he's so good at the job he's doing. And it wasn't clear what sort of Secretary General they should have next, where that person should come from, what their vision should be for the alliance. And instead, unfortunately, the debate has been a lot around, should it be, does it have to be a head of state? Should it be a woman this time? Is it enough to have a minister? And that really completely it's almost completely irrelevant. What matters is that it's somebody who can steer NATO through these extremely complicated and choppy waters, which is why they gave Stoltenberg another year.
Jamie, if we were looking at this job in, say, 1996, 1997, this wasn't a level of job that a prime minister would have or a president would have. It seems to have been elevated in importance. Does whoever takes over the role next somehow get much more of a visionary role in where NATO goes?
Yes, I think so. And I really think that Elisabeth has put her finger on the key point here, which is a point I would have made as well. You know, when you do succession planning, Philip, in a big organisation, you don't look at names. You think, you know, what kind of organisation do we want to be in 10 years' time? What is the image, the messages we want to convey? And therefore, what's the best profile of the person to get us there? And I think if NATO started that way round and then looked at names rather than the other way, it would be better served. And hopefully the fact that NATO has given itself a year gives the time for that more systematic, rational process to be undertaken. For example, if you were in the 1990s, you would probably said, well, the focus is the global south. We're in Afghanistan, we're in Iraq, we're doing things in Libya a little bit later on. And therefore having a Secretary General who can really relate to these cultures, Muslim cultures, the Arab League or whatever, could have been very important then. Today you may think, well, it's all about collective defence and therefore an Eastern European is going to best articulate that message. There are those... And
why not a soldier, though?
Well,
or a sailor or an air forceman.
Because you have excellent soldiers. You have, for example, with General Chris Cavoli, one of the best Supreme Allied Commanders Europe that I've ever known. You have a chairman of the military committee, a very gifted Dutch admiral doing that job at the moment. So frankly, you have lots of good soldiers in NATO already, but it is a diplomatic job at the end of the day. It's about making the case for NATO. It's about linking up new challenges like climate change to younger generations, reaching out to women as Elizabeth rightly pointed out, being able to bring in partners like the Asia-Pacific countries as well. So there are, I would argue that as great as soldiers are, there are enough good ones in NATO already. What we need are good diplomats as well.
Martin, I'm assuming you would echo that because I can see you nodding there.
Absolutely. And I think even more fundamental than that is one of the key principles in terms of civil-military relations in democratic systems is that ultimately civilians control the military, and the senior job in the NATO structure, the NATO international structure, is that of the Secretary General. And obviously there are very high-ranking military officers in the NATO integrated military structures as well. But the principle is that at the end of the day, the soldiers take their orders from civilians. And so it's not just the way it's developed or a fortunate coincidence that the Secretary General of NATO is a civilian, and that's an entrenched understanding. It actually embodies that key principle as to how relations between the civilians, the elected leaders, the politicians, and their militaries ought to work in a functioning democratic system.
Martin, Elizabeth, Jamie, thank you very much, all three of you, for joining me today. I'm afraid that is all that we have time for, but remember, you can see more discussion and debate if you head on over to our YouTube channel. Just go there and search for Roundtable TRT World. But for now, from me here and all of the team, thank you for watching and goodbye.